In the marble palaces of Rome, where emperors stuffed themselves on roasted peacock tongues and senators soaked their wrinkled skin in milk baths, there was another world, far uglier, far darker. Rome loved to polish its statues and brag about law, order, and civilization. But behind those marble facades, in villas shadowed by flickering oil lamps, there lurked a secret that was grotesque even by Roman standards. It wasn't the gladiators bleeding out in the Colosseum. It wasn't the crucifixions lining the roads like grotesque mile markers. No, this was quieter, hidden, and it consumed lives in silence. These were not workers or farmers. They were not even slaves meant for fields and mines. They were children, taken for their appearance, their youth, their vulnerability, taken from the smoking ruins of conquered towns, paraded at the markets, and sold off to aristocrats who cloaked cruelty with philosophy. They were trained, broken, and reshaped into living ornaments for the amusement of the wealthy. Rome celebrated itself as a city of laws, but it legalized practices so twisted that even today, 2,000 years later, they make the skin crawl. The year was 117 CE. Rome was at its peak. The empire stretched from Britain to the deserts of Mesopotamia. Armies stomped across the map, and gold poured into the capital. Hadrian had just seized the throne, polishing his image as the wise philosopher king. But beneath his clean statues and carefully trimmed beard, another economy thrived. Not just in Rome, but across every corner of the empire, from Gaul to Egypt to Asia Minor. Human lives were currency, and some were considered priceless. Slave traders knew exactly what to look for. They didn't want brawny arms or strong backs. They wanted children. The criteria were precise: pale, unblemished skin, delicate features, big eyes like frightened deer. Boys from Syria or Egypt fetched the highest prices, their so-called exotic beauty twisted into an excuse for cruelty. Imagine the scene. The market stinks of sweat, blood, and coin. Children stand trembling, stripped bare, while merchants jab fingers into their ribs, tilt their chins, and check their teeth like livestock. They argue over prices while the children's lives vanish with every clink of a coin. A quick sale was mercy. Repeated sales were torment, each transaction peeling away another piece of identity until the child became nothing but a number in a ledger. Once purchased, the ordeal didn't stop. It began. Names were stripped away and replaced with soft Greek diminutives, mocking reminders that they were now property. Their languages, their stories, their homes, obliterated. Their bodies altered too, hair plucked, skin smeared with toxic powders to gleam like porcelain, even though it poisoned them slowly. Diets starved them lean, keeping their figures frozen in false youth. And sometimes worse, medical mutilations ensured a boy would never grow into manhood, his body trapped in the twilight of childhood. And then came the training, not education to better a life, but training to entertain masters. They were taught music, poetry, dance, conversation, enough to seem witty but never enough to threaten. They were drilled to smile at the right time, laugh when commanded, and suffer in silence. Failure meant whips, starvation, and isolation. Success brought silk tunics, fine jewelry, and better scraps of food. The bitter illusion of privilege. But gilded cages are still cages, and Rome was full of children rattling theirs unseen. By dawn, they were already at work. Hours grooming, perfumed, painted, dressed up like dolls. At banquets, they poured wine with rehearsed grace, all eyes devouring them as much as the food. They plucked lyres, recited poetry, danced while senators smirked and guests stared. They were told to be beautiful but never vain, clever but never bold, present but never human. One misstep could mean a beating or worse. And the nights? Rome's writers used polite words, allusions, and veiled lines to describe what happened once the lamps went out. But the silence in their writing screams louder than any euphemism. These children endured what no one should. Their bodies scarred, their spirits broken, all to satisfy masters who hid their filth behind the word civilization. In Roman law, property could not refuse its owner, and these children were property. Hadrian himself kept one. Antinous, the boy paraded as the emperor's lover, the child immortalized in statues with godlike beauty. Historians later romanticized him, painted their bond as a tragic love story. But strip away the poetry, and what remains? A child, barely 13 when he entered Hadrian's orbit. Could he say no? Could he refuse the emperor of the world? Survival meant submission. But at what price? Even in marble, Antinous' silence is deafening. His life, like so many others, swallowed whole by Rome's appetite for beauty and cruelty. Rome called itself eternal. But for these boys, eternity was a nightmare that ended only when they were used up, sold off, or left to rot. And that was only the beginning. The selection of Rome's boy concubines was not random. It wasn't like tossing dice or plucking grapes off a vine. No, Rome perfected it into a grotesque science. Slave traders were the vultures of the empire, circling markets from Delos to Rome itself. And they knew exactly what their customers wanted. Forget loyalty, forget strength. Rome's elite wanted smooth skin, wide eyes, and fragile little bodies. Boys between 7 and 14, not too young to collapse, not too old to grow a beard. Picture the scene, a market so loud it could deafen Jupiter himself, screaming traders, coins clinking, goats bleating, and in the middle, naked children trembling on auction blocks, their ribs poked out, their knees knocked together, and fat senators leaned in close to examine them like meat. One man checks a boy's teeth, another tugs his hair, another even prods the poor kid's thighs. Good symmetry, he grunts, as though symmetry were something you could grill for dinner. The boys weren't human. They were livestock in the eyes of their buyers. And here's the kicker. Roman buyers had preferences. Oh yes, exoticism was big business. Syrian boys, premium price tag. Egyptian boys, even higher. Why? Because Roman men convinced themselves that darker eyes and foreign beauty made for better trophies at dinner parties. Let's be honest, it was less about beauty and more about showing off. A senator with a boy from Asia Minor could brag about it like he was flaunting a brand new chariot. If Instagram had existed, these creeps would have been posting selfies with their concubines under hashtags like #conquered luxury and #slave goals. For the boys, every sale was another piece of their lives stripped away. The lucky ones, if such a word can even apply, were bought quickly. The unlucky bounced from one fat bastard to another, each transaction peeling off the last shreds of their identity. Imagine being renamed 5 times before you turned 12. Yesterday you were Marcus. Today you're Dionysia, because your new master thought it sounded cuter. Tomorrow? Who knows? Maybe pretty little wine server number 3. And Rome didn't just stop at names. No, the whole identity had to be destroyed. Their native languages were forbidden, their songs silenced, their memories stomped out. Boys were transformed into pale ornaments, literally. Their hair yanked out with resin until their bodies gleamed smooth, their faces smeared with white lead to keep them ghostly pale. Of course, that lead slowly poisoned them. Imagine slowly dying of face paint while your master brags that you look divine. And let's not forget diet. These boys weren't fed to grow strong. They were fed to stay small, fragile, and eternally boyish. Their meals were like modern crash diets, bread here, watered wine there, maybe some olives if the master was feeling generous. Forget protein. Rome basically invented the starve yourself pretty trend, except it wasn't voluntary. But the real terror, the knife, castration, sometimes partial, sometimes complete. A brutal cut meant to trap the boy's body in eternal childhood. Officially, some emperors frowned on it, but unofficially, surgeons kept busy. The result? Children who could never grow into men, mutilated forever so their masters could keep them beautiful. If that doesn't make your blood boil, nothing will. Now here's where the Roman sense of irony kicked in. While they tortured these kids into porcelain dolls, they also trained them. Music, poetry, dance. Not for their own joy, oh no, but to make them entertaining props. A boy might be whipped one morning, then expected to pluck a lyre and recite Homer with a smile by evening. Failure meant beatings, starvation, or being locked away in some dark corner like broken furniture. Success, a silk tunic and maybe some perfume, because nothing says privilege like being the best-dressed prisoner in the house. And yes, this entire circus had rules. Be witty but not too clever. Be pretty but never vain. Be graceful, but never forget, your property. One wrong joke, one wrong smile, and you could end up flogged until your skin split. Honestly, it's like walking a tightrope while lions snap at your heels. Except the lions were senators with bad breath and worse appetites. Rome dressed this cruelty up in gold chains and silk. But gold chains are still chains, and perfume can't hide the stench of a broken childhood. Imagine a boy waking before dawn, spending hours painted, perfumed, polished, then paraded in front of drunken men who laughed at him like he was a clown. Now imagine doing it every single day, knowing you'd never escape. That was their life. And while the Romans congratulated themselves for philosophy and law, their concubines lived in constant fear. Every touch, every glance, every night meant danger. It was a system so polished, so normalized, that people treated it like just another luxury, like buying a fancy goblet or a marble bust. Only here, the luxury was a living child. That was Rome's marketplace of misery. Beautiful boys in golden cages, dressed in silk, fed on starvation, and trained to smile while their souls crumbled. Civilization, Roman style. The daily life of a Roman boy concubine was nothing short of a nightmare, disguised as luxury. Imagine waking before dawn, not to play, not to run through the fields, but to be scrubbed, plucked, perfumed, and painted like a doll. Hours of grooming, every hair ripped out, every blemish hidden, until the boy no longer looked like a child, but like some sick ornament on display. His clothing? Bright short tunics to flaunt his youth, jewelry that screamed owned property, sometimes even golden collars, shiny reminders that he was as free as a chained dog. And from that moment on, the performance began. Every step, every smile, every tilt of the head had to be rehearsed. They poured wine with delicate gestures, danced while guests stared with hungry eyes, played the lyre while pretending not to notice the groping hands. They had to be beautiful but never vain, clever but never too sharp, available but never eager. It was a performance so tight that a single misstep meant punishment. Beatings, starvation, isolation, take your pick. Rome had plenty of options for breaking a child's spirit. Now here's the Roman joke of it all. These boys were fed like prized pets. Silk on their backs, fine perfumes, and even delicacies on their plates. Meanwhile, field slaves gnawed on barley mush. So from the outside, they looked like pampered pets. But here's the punchline. They weren't allowed to eat enough to grow. Congratulations, you're dining on honey cakes, but only one slice because heaven forbid you sprout a chest hair. Rome had a diet plan more twisted than modern Instagram influencers. Forget keto. This was die young, stay pretty. The daytime horrors were one thing, but when night fell, the curtain dropped. Ancient historians used polite euphemisms to describe what happened in those bedchambers. They said companionship, they said delight, but we know better. The truth was abuse, routine, systematic, unrelenting. And in Roman law, property had no right to say no. A boy's body was his master's playground, and the scars, inside and out, were just collateral damage. Even emperors played this game. Hadrian, the so-called philosopher king, had his favorite, Antinous. Statues of the boy still stand today, carved with angelic faces and perfect curls, as though marble could hide the truth. Antinous was maybe 13 when Hadrian pulled him into his orbit. Historians, with their rose-colored pens, call it a romance. But let's be real, a teenage boy and the emperor of the world? That wasn't love. It was survival dressed up as poetry. And boy, did Hadrian make a show of it. Antinous traveled with him, shared his table, even shared his bed. And when the boy mysteriously died in the Nile at 19, Hadrian wailed like he'd lost half his soul. He renamed cities after him, filled Rome with statues, even made him a god. But the one thing missing from all those monuments? Antinous' voice, his choice, his pain. Historians gave us Hadrian's grief in marble, but the boy himself was reduced to a silent decoration in someone else's tragedy. And here's the kicker. Antinous was lucky. Yes, lucky. If being paraded around the empire as an emperor's pet counts as fortune, he had silk, he had jewels, he had protection. But for every Antinous, there were thousands of boys whose names we'll never know. They weren't carved in marble or sung about in poems. They were hidden in villas, serving lesser men, forgotten the moment their beauty faded. They didn't get statues. They got scars, graves without names and memories erased. Roman poets occasionally let the mask slip. Martial, that snide little gossip of the first century, wrote mocking verses about wealthy men and their boy toys. He thought it was comedy, making fun of men drooling over slaves while pretending to be cultured. But what Martial laughed at was tragedy for the boys. Children forced to act out their own humiliation while drunk men clapped and giggled. The joke was never funny to the ones bleeding behind closed doors. Medical texts from the period quietly confirmed the damage. Doctors like Galen and Celsus wrote clinical notes about injuries that could only have come from abuse, torn bodies, infections, mutilations, written down as if they were discussing cattle. Imagine your suffering turned into someone else's medical curiosity. Oh yes, another concubine with permanent damage. Fascinating. That was the level of compassion Rome gave its children. And the law, even crueler. Court cases list boys alongside livestock. Sales contracts lump them with furniture. Runaways were hunted, tortured, killed. Some were murdered by jealous masters. Others discarded the moment they grew too old. Every legal word was a reminder. These weren't humans in Rome's eyes. They were inventory, property, objects. Rome wanted its concubines to shine at feasts and whisper poetry by candlelight. But beneath the glitter, they were children robbed of choice, trapped in roles that mocked their very existence. The empire of marble and gold was also an empire of broken boys, hidden in plain sight, silenced by law, art, and philosophy. That was the daily life, perfume on the surface, rot underneath. Rome loved the performance, but for the boys it was a never-ending stage play where the script was written in blood. The most disturbing part wasn't just the abuse itself. It was how normal it all became. Rome didn't hide this filth in some back alley. Oh no, they paraded it like fashion. Boy concubines were displayed at feasts, brought to theaters, even dressed in fine silks to show off their owner's wealth. To the Roman elite, a child slave wasn't a shameful secret. He was an accessory, like a pet peacock, but with eyes full of fear. And the culture played along. Poets wrote verses comparing these boys to flowers and gems, their youth reduced to metaphors for beauty. Artists painted frescoes where delicate children were frozen in poses of submission. Mosaics captured them pouring wine, kneeling gracefully, eyes lowered just enough to suggest obedience. What we call child abuse today, Rome called interior decoration. But let's be clear, this wasn't just art, it was propaganda. By wrapping abuse in poetry and painting, Rome convinced itself this wasn't cruelty, it was sophistication. The same way some people today brag about their wine collection, senators bragged about their collection of delights. That was literally one of the terms used, delicia, which sounds fancy until you realize it basically meant my little chew toy. And here's where the jokes write themselves. Rome had the nerve to pride itself on philosophy, on dignity, virtue, and wisdom, while keeping kids locked in perfume cages. Seneca, that grand stoic, wagged his finger at men for indulging too much with their concubines. Not because the boys were suffering, but because it made the men soft. Imagine telling someone, hey, maybe stop abusing children. Not because it's horrific, but because it might ruin your macho image. That was Roman moral philosophy in a nutshell. The dehumanization went so deep that even signs of trauma were brushed off. Depression, self-harm, escape attempts, all explained away as character flaws. Romans weren't blind, they just didn't care. If a boy was miserable, it was his fault for not being pleasing enough. Talk about gaslighting. Oh, you tried to run away from your master who mutilated you. Weak character, boy. Weak character. The empire's appetite for beauty turned into an assembly line of misery. Conquest didn't just bring gold and land, they brought children. Generals bragged about victories in Gaul or Syria, then smuggled home wagon loads of trembling boys to sell at auction. Some commanders even targeted regions specifically because they were known for beautiful captives. Imagine military strategy based on how pretty the locals looked. Rome called it conquest. In reality, it was human trafficking with a legion's stamp of approval. And the cycle kept feeding itself. The more Rome conquered, the more children they captured. The more children, the bigger the market. The bigger the market, the more normalized it became. At one point, a man could walk into a dinner party with a boy on his arm and get admiring nods instead of disgust. That's how broken the moral compass was. Rome treated children like wine vintages. Ah yes, this one's a Syrian. Notes of cinnamon and despair. The psychological gymnastics required to sustain this system are mind-bending. Rome convinced itself that the children weren't children. Language stripped away their humanity. They weren't boys, they were treasures. They weren't victims, they were ornaments. Even the names given to them were meant to disguise reality. sweet, feminine Greek nicknames to erase their identities. The cruelty wasn't just physical, it was linguistic. Rome literally renamed abuse until it sounded like art. And let's not forget the philosophers. Stoics worried more about free-born Roman youth imitating the mannerisms of concubines than about the concubines themselves. These boys are corrupting society, they complained, as if the victims were the problem. Imagine blaming the abused child for ruining your cultural vibe. That's like blaming a broken window for ruining the view, not the rock that smashed it. Even the medical community played its part. Doctors scribbled notes about treating boys for injuries caused by overuse, like they were writing recipes. They cataloged infections, scars, castration complications, all in dry clinical Latin. Between the lines, though, the horror is obvious. They knew exactly what was happening, but instead of outrage, they treated it like routine maintenance. Keep the property alive. Keep the toy functioning. That was the Hippocratic oath in Rome's world. And yet, for all their normalization, there were cracks. A few voices dared to object, but always for the wrong reasons. Some worried about men looking too effeminate. Others fretted over moral decay. Hardly anyone stood up and said, "Hey, maybe stop mutilating and enslaving kids." The silence of Roman society was deafening. This was the great contradiction of Rome. The empire that carved laws into bronze tablets also carved the innocence out of children. The civilization that built aqueducts and roads also built slave markets filled with sobbing boys. And the society that bragged about order and reason laughed while children performed their own degradation. Civilization, Rome style, was rotten at its core. They normalized nightmares until they looked like entertainment. They dehumanized children until they were furniture. They made cruelty fashionable, artful, even philosophical. Rome loved to talk about honor and dignity, but beneath the marble floors, what they truly worshipped was power, the power to own, break, and discard human lives. Rome wasn't just cruel for fun. No, it was cruel with a ledger. Boy concubines weren't only ornaments or amusements. They were investments. Each one had a price tag, and Rome loved turning suffering into spreadsheets. A boy wasn't a child. He was a line item, purchased for obscene amounts, groomed, fed, trained, then treated like living stock portfolios. Some masters even insured their boys, as though you could file a claim if your concubine died of despair. Imagine walking into an office. "Yes, my 12-year-old property has broken down. Can I get a payout?" Every clause in those contracts meant one thing: a human life reduced to paperwork. A boy wasn't measured in hopes or dreams, but in return on investment. Can he play the lyre? Can he recite poetry? Can he pour wine without trembling? Excellent, that's worth 3 extra denarii. Rome basically invented LinkedIn for child slaves, complete with skills endorsements, except no boy ever applied for the job. Festivals turned this cruelty into comedy. During Saturnalia, the December festival of role reversals, concubines were sometimes dressed in their master's clothes and allowed to give orders. Sounds like fun? Wrong. It was a sick parody. For one night, a boy could mockingly pretend to be free, barking orders he knew would be reversed at dawn. Rome loved a good joke, even if the punchline was a child's humiliation. It was the empire's idea of holiday cheer. Forget Christmas carols. Rome's December soundtrack was children forced to play act their slavery while drunk men roared with laughter. And dinner parties? Those were circuses of degradation. Picture a villa full of perfumed guests reclining on couches, goblets in hand. The concubine enters, graceful as trained, and immediately hands grope at him while lewd comments fly across the room. Guests chuckle, the host beams, and the boy dies a little more inside. His humiliation wasn't just tolerated, it was the entertainment. Rome didn't need Netflix. It had cruelty served live with wine. What made this worse was how deeply the system was built into Rome's very foundations. The legal system, complicit, the military, supplied the merchandise, the economy, profited. Even religion, that supposed voice of morality, looked the other way. Temples owned slaves, and don't think they were always used to sweep floors. Even the gods' houses had their dirty little corners. Rome's cruelty wasn't a glitch, it was a feature. And when Christianity started creeping across the empire, one might hope things would change. Spoiler alert, they didn't. Constantine, the so-called Christian emperor, introduced reforms here and there. Maybe some rules about castration, maybe a bit of regulation. But the reality? The trade continued. Now it was cloaked in thicker hypocrisy. The bishops thundered against sin while quietly enjoying the same luxuries. Boys were still bought, still groomed, still mutilated, but now with added spiritual guilt. Rome invented Catholic guilt centuries early. The church fathers wagged their fingers at pederasty, but their concern wasn't for the boys. No, their concern was for the abusers' souls. Imagine telling a victim, "Sorry, you're too tainted to reach salvation unless you crawl through years of penance." That was the Christian upgrade. Abuse plus shame. As if the scars on their bodies weren't already heavy enough, they were told their souls were dirty too. By the 4th and 5th centuries, as Rome cracked under invasions and decay, things got even worse for the boys. The empire's economy wobbled, and luxury households couldn't afford their golden pets anymore. So what happened? Abandonment. Boys were cast out into streets, their beauty faded, their usefulness gone. Others were sold east into the Byzantine Empire, where the practice marched on in new clothes. Rome fell, but the nightmares migrated. The collapse didn't end the suffering, it spread it. For those trained only for servitude, survival was nearly impossible. What's a concubine to do in a ruined empire? He couldn't plow a field. He couldn't build a road. His only skill was pleasing men who were now dead or bankrupt. Many likely perished in the chaos, nameless victims buried in rubble while new masters looted their world. Imagine being cast aside in your 20s after a childhood of torture, standing in ruins with nothing but scars and memories. Rome called it history. The boys called it the end. This was Rome's final joke, a society that prided itself on glory and marble, but left its children broken, discarded, and forgotten. The empire collapsed, but its cruelty echoed forward, staining cultures that came after. Byzantines, Islamic courts, others, Rome handed them the blueprint for exploitation, neatly rolled up like a scroll. The empire's legacy wasn't just aqueducts and law codes, it was also generations of children turned into commodities. Rome loved to boast that it was eternal. But what truly lasted wasn't the marble statues or the coins, it was the cruelty, exported like wine across borders and centuries. The boys' suffering didn't end with the fall of Rome, it simply changed uniforms. Rome's story of boy concubines does not sit neatly in a museum case. It isn't just ancient dust, marble statues, and Latin inscriptions. It's a scar that runs across history. The empire normalized child exploitation so thoroughly that later civilizations picked up the script and ran with it. Byzantines, Islamic courts, medieval kingdoms, all found ways to dress up the same old evil in new costumes. Rome handed them the recipe, and they baked the same rotten bread. And here's the most chilling part. The methods may have changed, but the pattern didn't. Children are still trafficked, still exploited, still turned into products for the powerful. The powerful still prey on the vulnerable, always with clean hands and polished words. Rome called it civilization. Today it's called markets or networks. Different names, same cruelty. Historians for centuries weren't much better. Most were men, most were sympathetic to emperors rather than slaves, and most treated the subject like an awkward footnote. Hadrian and Antinous, romanticized as a love story, thousands of nameless boys, reduced to numbers or ignored completely. That's like writing a book about Titanic and focusing only on the captain's hat while skipping the passengers who drowned. And only recently have scholars begun peeling away the marble gloss, confronting Rome's legacy for what it was: systematic child abuse, dressed up as sophistication. Each document, each medical text, each legal clause is another ghost pulled back into the light. The process is uncomfortable, but necessary, because every scrap of evidence is a voice speaking from the grave saying, "We were here, we suffered, don't let it happen again." Now let's pause for the funny but awful irony. Rome spent centuries bragging about dignity, discipline, and virtue. Yet behind closed doors, it was running the largest pedophile ring in antiquity. Imagine Cicero wagging his finger about morality in the Senate by day, then heading home at night to abuse a child while muttering, "Ah yes, the glory of Rome." The hypocrisy was so thick you could build an aqueduct with it, and the warning echoes. Power without accountability always breeds monsters. Rome proved it over and over. Give one man absolute control over another, and the whip becomes his handwriting, the chains his love letters. Civilizations love to think they're enlightened, but all it takes is profit and silence for cruelty to become normal again. Rome's boy concubines are proof of that. The victims themselves, those boys with names erased, are the heart of this story. They weren't marble statues or painted ornaments. They were children with dreams, fears, laughter, and tears. Maybe one loved to sing in his village before he was stolen. Maybe another wanted to be a soldier like his father. Maybe another clung to the memory of a mother's lullaby, even as it faded. Rome crushed those dreams under sandals and wine goblets, and history nearly crushed them again by forgetting. But remembering restores something. It doesn't undo the suffering, but it denies Rome the victory of silence. Every time we tell their story, every time we strip away the marble polish and call it what it was, abuse, cruelty, normalized horror, we return a little dignity to the voiceless. And the reflection isn't just historical. Look around. How many of our modern luxuries are still built on the backs of exploited children? How many industries profit from silence and willful blindness? The Romans looked away from suffering in their own households. How different are we when we ignore exploitation today because it's tucked behind shiny packaging? Rome isn't gone. It's hiding in plain sight. That's why the story of the boy Concubines isn't just about ancient Rome. It's a mirror, a grotesque one, but a mirror nonetheless. It shows how easily humans can convince themselves that cruelty is normal, even fashionable. It shows that civilizations can build wonders and still rot at the core. It shows that every empire has its victims, and those victims rarely get statues. And yet, even in this darkness, there were sparks. Some Romans freed concubines out of guilt. Some boys survived long enough to carve out scraps of lives. There were moments of compassion, resilience, even dignity. Because human beings, even broken, find ways to endure. Rome couldn't fully crush that. But the lesson remains. Civilization isn't measured by its monuments or its military. It's measured by how it treats its most vulnerable. Rome built aqueducts, yes, but it also built markets where children were sold like fruit. That is the real measure, and it's a measure that damns the empire as much as any barbarian invasion ever did. So what do we do with this story? We remember. We sit with the discomfort. We refuse to gloss over the pain. We use the past as a warning, not a romantic backdrop. The boys of Rome can't be saved, but their ghosts can guide us. The marble halls have crumbled. The emperors are dust, but the moral lesson remains. Power without conscience will devour innocence every single time. Rome's boy concubines speak to us across 2 millennia, not in words, but in silence. A silence heavy enough to crush stone until we finally decide to listen.